Hello, and welcome to your first lecture, Your Brain in Middle School, the Neuroscience of Adolescence. This is going to be part one of a two-part series. All you need to do is watch part one. In fact, part one is the only video that will be included in this lecture. As you're going through the lecture today, I'm going to ask you to take some notes. The information that I want you to write down will be underlined on each slide. If you don't see anything underlined, you don't need to write anything down. However, if you think the information is interesting or you want to capture it for later, you are welcome to do so. I'll also be posting these slides so that you can have access to them later. But please practice taking notes of the information that's underlined in this lecture. So let's get started. During middle school, there are a few parts of the brain that I want to talk about. And so this is a bit more like a biology lesson to get us started. The first parts of the brain are considered the limbic system. And you can see all this area in the middle of the brain, closest to the brain stem, that are all considered part of the limbic system. And you'll see that word later. One thing I want you to notice about this is that this is the first part of the brain to develop. It's in the center. It's very important. And again, it is part of the first parts of the brain to develop. There's a few important pieces that I want to point out too. The first is this hippocampus, which has an important role in learning and memory. Again, it is one of the first parts of the brain to develop. The second part of the brain that I want you to look at is the amygdala. The amygdala is the part of the brain that controls your fight or flight response. So you can imagine, as humans were developing, this was a very important part of the brain. It was what you used to evaluate whether or not the situation was dangerous or not, whether or not you should fight or flee. So if you were a Neanderthal back in the caveman times and a giant saber-toothed tiger jumped out in front of you, this would be the part of the brain that would make a decision about whether or not you were going to stand and fight or run away. And your survival depended upon that response. You may have felt this before in situations that were really scary, or you felt your adrenaline spike all of a sudden. A lot of times that's your amygdala having a response to a situation. Those are the two most important parts that I want you to think about as you think about this limbic system of the brain. The second part of the brain, or other parts of the brain, are all of the various lobes that form the outer part of your brain. All of these lobes work together as they develop to make you, and to manage all of the complex tasks that your body is going through on a daily basis. Everything from your vision in the occipital lobe, here in blue, to different movements with your motor cortex, the ways in which your senses and the ways in which you connect with the world through your sensory cortex, your temporal lobe, where memory, understanding, and language takes place, and most importantly for adolescents, your frontal lobe, which focuses on executive functioning, planning, organizing, problem solving, and many of those tasks that you begin to develop independence for during middle school. And again, we're going to be talking all about these different parts of the brain in a little bit. But what I want you to think about is the way in which the brain develops. Now, please remember that everybody develops differently and at different paces and at different times. So while we might talk about this as having your we might talk about how your frontal lobe may not develop until your 20s. Some may develop sooner than others. Now, I want you to write down these three phrases. First brain, survival. Second brain, language. Third brain, complex tasks. Because it's important to think about the ways in which they develop. And as I mentioned earlier, that limbic system, the core of your brain, is the first to develop. And the primary function of that first brain is survival. And again, there's a reason for that. There's an evolutionary reason for why that part of the brain develops first, and it's because we need to survive to then continue to have more humans and have our species continue. The second part of the brain is where you begin to form language and make sense of the world. And that would be the next layer of the brain around the limbic system and the first brain. This is where you start to be able to interact with the world and interact with others and make sense of the world. And then finally, your third brain, which is sort of the culmination of everything, which really focuses on complex tasks, goal setting, organization, taking information and syncing it together with different other movements and actions. So it's the idea of the third brain really getting you to a place where you can accomplish complex tasks. And that evolution is really important to understand as we think about adolescence and your brain. So let's talk about the limbic system. Again, that's the first part of the brain to develop. That, during middle school, the limbic system is incredibly active and hypersensitive. And so the ways that that plays out in your life is that you tend to have a stronger sense of emotion, a heightened emotion, which can also relate to a heightened emotional response. You just might be more emotional, which is very normal during middle school. Along with that is a very strong desire for belonging and connection. Again, you can probably see the connection between emotion and the feelings of belonging. And that's your limbic system seeking that emotional connection. Okay? That's why it also can be challenging when your friendships and relationships change during middle school. It can be scary, it can feel hurtful, but also making new friends can feel even more exciting. Another aspect of the development of your limbic system during this time, or the heightened awareness of it or sensitivity of it during middle school, is sometimes middle schoolers can be considered irrational. And as your limbic system is heightened, you can make irrational decisions because often they're based on emotion rather than an actual rational thought. You may make a decision and not really know why you did it. And that's often your emotional side of your brain taking over for the rational part. It also is an acknowledgement that the rational part of your brain is not fully developed right now. And that's why during middle school we talk a lot about peer pressure, because the decisions that you make during this time when your limbic system is so heightened, the decisions have a lot to do with seeking connection, pleasing your friends, and belonging. So in many ways, your body and your brain at this moment is a lot like a race car. You're going 200 miles an hour, and you're being impacted by different things that are going on, such as friendship dynamics, success with different activities that you're attempting, relationships with parents, relationships with siblings, all of that's going on. And your brain is a lot like a race car at this moment. There's another reason for that, which we're going to talk about in our next section, part 2, which has to do with the amount that you are learning at this time, but we won't get into that right now. And a general reminder about your limbic system and where it resides in your brain, as well as thinking about the impact of the amygdala, the part that controls your fight or flight response, the hippocampus, which has an important role in memory and learning, and other aspects of the brain in the limbic system. Okay? So just as a remember, think about that limbic system, and remember, it is very heightened right now. So the next part of the brain I want to talk to you about is called the prefrontal cortex, and it resides in the frontal lobe. And again, as I mentioned, the frontal lobe is responsible for executive functioning, like organizing, planning, goal setting, and accomplishing those tasks. So just remember that. It's very important. I'm going to jump back to the slide that has my underlined words on it. So again, this is the part of the brain in the frontal lobe that focuses on organization and planning. You may be wondering, why do I have to use a planner right now? Well, part of the reason is because your frontal lobe is not fully developed. It is the last part of the brain to develop, and it usually is not done developing until your 20s. So imagine and realize that as you go through high school and into college, your frontal lobe, your prefrontal cortex, the thing that you use to organize and plan, is not going to be fully developed. You are going to need to develop other strategies to support your brain during this time. It's so important, and that's why we require you to utilize those systems of organization. Again, it's not because we want to be mean. It's because it's how your brain is developing right now, and you need that backup system. The other important part or aspect of your prefrontal cortex, as you think about planning and sort of like assessment of situations, is this is what helps you analyze a situation for risk and potential consequences. Okay? So let's think of that scenario. All right? The scenario I like to use is, again, a peer pressure. And I was actually biking with my family the other weekend. We were riding along the Huron River, and we noticed that there were some kids that were on a bridge over the river. And they were thinking, it looked like they were thinking about jumping off. Having grown up in Ann Arbor, it was drilled into my head that you never jump off a bridge, even if it's right next to the water, because you don't know how deep that water is. I've heard of countless stories of people getting very, very injured by doing that. So as we were biking, I was thinking, okay, these are some adolescent kids. Again, they don't have their prefrontal cortex fully developed. They are with friends, and they might want to try to show off in front of their friends. Because their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, they are not able to analyze that situation for risk. And because they want to feel that belonging, and because they like to feel that sense of risk-taking, they might choose to do that, to jump off that bridge without thinking through all of the potential consequences. And you can think of numerous examples like that in which you're together with a group of friends, and you might make a decision that you wouldn't make otherwise. There's an interesting statistic that over 90% of car accidents of people between the ages of 16 and 25 happen when there are other friends in the car with the driver, which just speaks to the fact that when those friends get together in that sort of social situation, and your limbic system is so active, and your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, you tend to make bad decisions. And it's important to know that so that you can hopefully try to regulate yourself when you are with your friends and there's a situation that feels maybe dangerous or risky, or you're not sure if you should do it. Take that extra time to really analyze the situation and decide whether or not you want to do it. And hopefully, if it's a dangerous situation, you don't make that decision. So in a lot of ways, again, your brain is like a race car flying through life. And your prefrontal cortex, your frontal lobe, is not fully developed, which I like to call your brakes. So as your race car is flying through life without brakes, and there comes a dangerous situation or a situation that might get you in trouble, like a wall, those brakes are not there. So you've got to think through other strategies to help yourself regulate those situations, especially when you're with peers. Okay? So, vital to think through as you are developing during middle school. This is the end of part 1 of the Your Brain in Middle School series. On Google Classroom, you'll find your response assignment, which will ask you to answer the following critical thinking question. You can post your response in that assignment for review. The question is, how can having a better understanding of your brain help you during middle school and beyond? So how do you think you are going to change based on this new information? In what ways, now that you hopefully have a better understanding of your brain, can you help yourself during middle school? So again, the question that I want you to answer, how can having a better understanding of your brain help you during middle school? If you have any questions, please send me an email. Thanks for watching, and have a great afternoon.